with Spain holding on to the territory well over a decade after most African countries had achieved their freedom from European colonialism, the Nationalist Polisario Front launched an armed independence struggle against Spain in 1973, and this, along with pressure from the United Nations, eventually forced the Spaniards to promise the people of what was then still known as Spanish Sahara to a referendum on the fate of the territory at the end of 1975. The International Court of Justice heard irredentist claims by Morocco and Mauritania and ruled in October of 1975 that despite pledges of fealty to the Moroccan Sultan back in the 19th century by some tribal leaders bordering the territory, and despite some close ethnic ties between some Sahrawi and Mauritanian tribes, the right of self-determination was paramount. And a visiting mission from the United Nations and engaged in an investigation of the situation in the territory that same year, and reported that a vast majority of Sahrawis supported independence under the leadership of the Polisario, not integration with Morocco or Mauritania. And during that same period, Morocco was threatening war with Spain over the territory. They assembled 300,000 Moroccans to march into Western Sahara to claim it, regardless of the wishes of the indigenous population, whose dialect, dress, and culture is very different than that of Moroccan Arabs to their north. I think this is important to remember. This is not a separatist movement. This is not a not this idea. Oh, they're all Arabs. Why do we need another Arab state? There are real clear distinctions culturally and in so many ways between Sahrawis and most Moroccans. And though the Spaniards had a much stronger military during that time, they were focused on the terminal illness of General Franco, who'd ruled the country for nearly 40 years. And Spain was facing increasing pressure from the United States, which wanted to back its ally, King Hassan, and did not want to see the leftist Polisario come to power. And so Spain reneged on its promise of self-determination and instead agreed in November 1975 to allow for Moroccan administration of the northern two-thirds of Western Sahara and Mauritanian administration for the southern third. And as Moroccan forces moved into Western Sahara, nearly half the population fled into neighboring Algeria, where they and their descendants remain in refugee camps to this day. Morocco and Mauritania rejected a series of unanimous UN Security Council resolutions calling for the withdrawal of foreign forces and recognition of the Sahrawis' right of self-determination. Meanwhile, the United States and France, despite voting in favor of these resolutions, blocked the United Nations from enforcing them. At the same time, the Polisario, which had been driven from the more heavily populated northern and western parts of the country, declared independence as the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. Thanks in part to Algeria providing significant amounts of military equipment and economic support, Polisario guerrillas fought well against both occupation armies, defeated Mauritania in 1979, making them to agree to turn their third of Western Sahara over to the Polisario, but then Morocco annexed the remaining southern part of the country as well. And so then the Polisario focused their armed struggle against Morocco, and by 1982 had liberated nearly 85% of the territory. But over the next 4 years, the tide of war turned in Morocco's favor, thanks to the United States and France dramatically increasing their support for the Moroccan effort. And the Americans and French, with some Saudi support, helped Morocco construct a 1,200-kilometer wall, primarily consisting of these two heavily fortified parallel sand berms, which eventually shut off more than 3/4 of Western Sahara, including virtually all the towns, all the territories, major towns, and natural resources from the Polisario. Meanwhile, the Moroccan government, through generous housing subsidies and other benefits, successfully encouraged thousands of Moroccan settlers, some of whom were from southern Morocco and of ethnic Sahrawi background, to immigrate to Western Sahara. And by the early 1990s, these Moroccan settlers outnumbered the remaining indigenous Sahrawis by a ratio of more than 2 to 1, and it's grown even more since then. And while rarely able to penetrate into Moroccan-controlled territory, the Polisario continued regular assaults against Moroccan occupation forces stationed along the wall until 1979, when the United Nations ordered a ceasefire to be monitored by UN peacekeeping forces, known as MINURSO. And the agreement included provisions for the return of Sahrawis to Western Sahara, followed by a UN-supervised referendum on the fate of the territory, which would allow Sahrawis native to Western Sahara to vote either for independence or for integration with Morocco. Neither the repatriation nor the referendum took place, however, due to Moroccan insistence on stacking the voter rolls with Moroccan settlers and other Moroccan citizens whom it claimed had tribal links to Western Sahara. Secretary General Kofi Annan enlisted former U.S. Secretary of State James Baker as a special representative to help resolve the impasse. But Morocco continued to ignore repeated demands from the United Nations that it cooperate with the referendum process, and French and American threats of a veto prevented the Security Council from enforcing its mandate. In 2000, under President Bill Clinton, the U.S. successfully convinced Baker and Annan to give up on efforts to proceed with the referendum as agreed upon by the UN and in the ceasefire agreement, and accept Moroccan demands that settlers be allowed to vote on the fate of the territory along with the indigenous Sahrawis. And eventually Baker came up with a proposal whereby both the Sahrawis and Moroccan settlers would be able to vote in the referendum, but the plebiscite would only take place after Western Sahara experienced significant autonomy under Sahrawi elected leaders for a 5-year period prior to the vote. And independence would be an option on the ballot for the referendum, and the UN would oversee the vote and guarantee advocates of integration and independence would both have the freedom to campaign openly. The Security Council approved the Baker Plan the summer of 2003. Under considerable pressure, Algeria and eventually the Polisario reluctantly accepted the new plan, but Moroccans, unwilling to allow the territory to enjoy even a brief period of autonomy and risk the possibility they might lose the plebiscite, rejected it. And once again, the United States and France blocked the United Nations from pressuring Morocco to comply with its international legal obligations, and Baker resigned, and things have more or less been in a stalemate ever since. Now, the Sahrawis have fought for their national rights primarily through legal and diplomatic means, not through violence. And even during the armed struggle against the occupation, a conflict that ended nearly a quarter century ago now, Polisario forces restricted their attacks exclusively to Moroccan armed forces. They never targeted civilians. No terrorism. The 150,000 Sahrawis living in the desert camps in Algeria are largely self-governing. Demonstrations and strikes in the late 1980s forced the Polisario to democratize the governance of the camps, where they maintain a functional, if barely subsistence, economy. And though devoutly Muslims, Sahrawi women are unveiled and enjoy equal rights with men regarding divorce, inheritance, and other legal matters. Sahrawi women also hold major leadership positions in the Polisario and the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, including posts of cabinet members and some of the prominent leaders of the nonviolent resistance in the occupied territories are women. And I mean, it's ironic that while some Western governments claim to seek the establishment of democratic governance throughout the Arab and Islamic world and equal rights to women, they have contributed greatly to the failure of the Sahrawis to establish such a system outside the refugee camps, and they support the occupation of the country by an autocratic monarchy. And so with going back to the diplomatic end, with Morocco's rejection of the Baker plans and threats of vetoes of any Security Council resolution that would push Morocco to compromise, a diplomatic settlement of the conflict looks highly unlikely. And with Morocco's powerful armed forces behind the separation wall and Algeria unwilling to support a resumption of guerrilla war, the Polisario appears to lack a military option as well. Now, Western Sahara, I want to emphasize, is recognized by the United Nations and virtually the entire international community as a non-self-governing territory. There have been a number of UN General Assembly resolutions that are explicit about calling Morocco's presence in Western Sahara an occupation. Just like the Israeli occupation. Indeed, even where the UN has not used the word occupation, it has consistently noted Morocco's presence is at most an administering power. Legally, Spain remains legally the administration, the sovereign power, and as a non-self-governing territory. By international law, the people of Western Sahara have the right to choose their own destiny, whether it be independence or incorporation into Morocco or some other alternative. And despite the UN General Assembly and Security Council resolutions calling, for such a referendum, again, the US and France and others have blocked that from happening. And this is a foreign belligerent occupation. But as happened in the 1980s in the Israeli-occupied territories, in the past decade or so, the locus of the Western Sahara freedom struggle has shifted from the military and diplomatic initiatives of an exiled liberation movement to a largely unarmed popular resistance from within. And young activists in the occupied territory and even in some of the Sahrawi populated parts of southern Morocco have confronted Moroccan troops repeatedly in street demonstrations and other forms of nonviolent action, despite the risk of shootings, mass arrests, and torture. And Sahrawis from all different sectors of society have engaged in protests, strikes, cultural celebrations, and other forms of civil resistance focused on such issues as educational policy, human rights, the release of political prisoners, and the right of self-determination. And in doing so, they've raised the cost of the occupation for the Moroccan government and increased the visibility of the Sahrawi cause. Indeed, perhaps most significantly, civil resistance has helped enable to build support for the Sahrawi movement among international non-governmental organizations, solidarity groups, and even some sympathetic Moroccans, despite restrictions by the Moroccan government of any kind of solidarity work. And internet communication has become a key element in the Sahrawi movement, with public chat rooms evolving as vital centers for sending messages, as breaking news regarding the resistance movement reached those in the Sahrawi diaspora and international activists. And despite attempts by the Moroccans to disrupt these contacts, the diaspora has continued to provide financial and other support to the resistance. I mean, there have been some complaints from inside the occupied territory that support for their movement by the older generation of Polisario leaders was inadequate. But the Polisario, I think, increasingly has recognized that given how little other options there are at the disposal, they've essentially played all their cards, and they realize that the only hope for independence has come from within the occupied territory, in combination, of course, with solidarity efforts from global civil society. Now, the the Moroccans have recently put forward what they call an autonomy proposal, which would say that would and the United States, France, other countries have pushing this as an alternative to referendum. But I could go in some detail if you want on the question and answer why the autonomy proposal is inadequate. But briefly, it's highly suspect, given how centralized the Moroccan regime is. How they have brutally suppressed any acts of self-determination, how they've broken their promises in the past, how autonomy agreements, inspired by repressive governments, have generally failed. I mean, think Eritrea, Kosovo, other examples. But primarily the problem is that it rules out the option of independence. And to be an true act of self-determination, independence has to be an option. Um, and But as inadequate as the Moroccan autonomy proposal may be, it nevertheless constitutes a reversal of Morocco's historical insistence that Western Sahara is as much a part of Morocco as anywhere else, and that the Sahrawis are indeed a distinct entity. And these protests in Western Sahara have begun to raise some awareness, even within Morocco, especially among intellectuals, human rights activists, pro-democracy groups, some moderate Islamists, and others who've been long suspicious of the government line in a number of areas, that not all Sahrawis see themselves as Moroccans, that this is not simply an Algerian plot, and there exists a genuine indigenous opposition to Moroccan rule. And one of the obstacles to the internal resistance in the occupied territory is that Moroccan, settlers outnumber the indigenous population by at least 3 to 1 at this point, and by more than that, even in the major cities, making certain tactics that were used effectively in similar struggles more problematic. For example, although a general strike, is one tactic people have used who are under occupation. The Palestinians have used this quite a bit, so have others. The large numbers of Moroccan settlers, combined with the minority of indigenous Sahrawis who oppose the independence, could likely fill the void resulting from the absence of much of the Sahrawi workforce. And although that might be alleviated by growing pro-independent sentiments among ethnic Sahrawi settlers from the southern part of Morocco, it presents challenges that have not been faced by largely nonviolent struggles in other occupied lands like East Timor, Kosovo, and of course in Palestine. And Morocco has been able to persist in flouting as I keep emphasizing, they've been able to get away with this in large part because the U.S. and France keep blocking the UN from doing anything. So its international solidarity, therefore, becomes increasingly critical. And so. And I think there's a lot that I've been very excited in recent years by the growth of the international solidarity movement in support of Palestine. And there are clear similarities between the two struggles. Morocco, like Israel, is in violation of a whole series of UN Security Council resolutions and a landmark decision by the World Court regarding their occupation. Morocco, like Israel, has illegally moved tens of thousands of settlers into the occupied territory. Morocco, like Israel, engages in gross and systematic human rights abuses in the occupied territories. Morocco, like Israel, has illegally built a separation wall through the occupied territory. Morocco, like Israel, relies on Western support to maintain the occupation by rendering the United Nations powerless to enforce international law. Morocco, like Israel, is able to maintain the occupation in part through support of multinational corporations. And just as Palestine is recognized by scores of countries and as an independent nation and as a full member of the Arab League, Western Sahara, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, is recognized by scores of countries and is a full member of the African Union. A recognized government that has its territory under forcible control of a foreign power would certainly be a case of occupation. So it's really unfortunate that almost all Arab states, despite their outspoken opposition to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian and Syrian land, have supported Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara. Now, supporters of the Moroccan occupation, make the claim that those who support independence are simply tools of the Algerian regime. Comparable to similar claims that the Palestinians are an invented people, or that Palestinian groups are simply tools of Arab regimes or of Iran. Again, denying the strong indigenous base of the opposition, some people are simply unaware of the Western Saharan situation. I mean, some come from autocratic Arab states which have supported the Moroccan takeover and whose media has reported the Moroccan line pretty consistently for 45 years or so. So they're unfamiliar with more objective analysis. Some are concerned that solidarity activism for Western Sahara might take attention away from the Palestinian issue or weaken the BDS movement. But though, as I will argue in a couple of minutes, I think it would actually strengthen both. Because my focus, what has gotten me interested in Palestine and Western Sahara, is on opposing occupation. I mean, there are many worthy issues with which one can become involved, and many injustices around the world that deserve to be challenged. And I believe a strong moral case can be made for independence of other nations as well. And I also acknowledge there is a certain degree of arbitrariness into which occupations are formally recognized as such and which ones are not. But at least we can start with a case where there is a much clearer legal basis. In the case of Palestine and Western Sahara, we're talking about a country invading, occupying, and colonizing another country, repressing its population in direct defiance of a series of UN Security Council resolutions and the most basic principles of international law. Indeed, the whole United Nations system is based on the principle of collective security against such aggression. And if the international community cannot effectively address such a clear-cut issue as occupation, what hope is there for addressing any of these other concerns, including those that are more complex? So let me take a few minutes to talk about BDS and in relation to both struggles. And I want to start off by pointing out that boycotts, divestment, and sanctions is not an organization or even a movement. It's a tactic, one that has been utilized under different names in support of a variety of causes over the years. One of the concerns to which these tactics of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions have been utilized is in part of campaigns to pressure Western companies to stop illegally profiting from foreign occupations, particularly in cases where members of the Security Council have blocked the UN from enforcing its resolutions, calling for withdrawal of occupation forces in accordance with the UN Charter. Now, boycott and divestment campaigns in previous decades targeted countries supporting South Africa's occupation of Namibia under the apartheid era, and Indonesia's occupation of East Timor. And the Western nations, and along with other countries, have imposed sanctions on Russia for its occupation of Crimea. There also, of course, was the BDS campaign against apartheid South Africa, demanding the country transform its political system from white minority rule to majority rule. There have been BDS campaigns targeting Burma and Sudan over the Darfur issue some years ago, and other countries with notorious human rights records. So BDS is not new. Yet the campaign targeting Israel, as I'm sure many of you are aware, has led to unprecedented controversy. And one of the concerns that's been raised, even by those who acknowledge Israel's ongoing violation of human rights and international law, is why focus on Israel? Why focus on the world's only Jewish state? And there are a number of reasons. While there are a large number of other governments which violate human rights, there is a much stronger legal case for international mobilization against human rights abuses in territories recognized as being under foreign belligerent occupation. For example, international law prohibits, under most circumstances, foreign companies from exploiting natural resources within such non-self-governing territories. There are also clear international prohibitions against occupying powers colonizing lands seized by military force with settlers. Similarly, there are a host of other there are a host of legal issues regarding the export of weapons and other military resources to countries that utilize them and suppressing the rights of those under foreign belligerent occupation, particularly when the use of such weapons results in civilian casualties. In addition, of course, Israel gets far more U.S. aid than any other country, and the U.S. has used its veto power in the United Nations, and people rationalize for it. Um, and but and yet here in the United States, in particular, we see this in some other countries. There are people who claim, oh, you're being you're singling out Israel illegally. You are anti-Semitic. In fact, in the United States, some state governments have passed laws forbidding contracts with companies and others which boycott Israel, and they have redefined Israel in the legislation to include territories controlled by Israel, thereby targeting even those who support boycotts and divestment only in regard to the occupation and settlements, not Israel itself, would also be punished. And so, clearly this claim that BDS, supporters of BDS are anti-Semitic is disingenuous and should not be taken seriously. It's designed to stifle dissent over government and corporate support of a right-wing government, and makes challenging real anti-Semitism all the more difficult. And but at the same time, I think it's important to recognize special sensitivity around these issues. I mean, while Israeli violations of international humanitarian law are no more justifiable than those committed by other repressive right-wing governments, the fact that Israel is the world's only Jewish state raises concerns as to whether Israel is being unfairly singled out. And for example, if there was only one black state in the world, even if it had occupied and invaded and occupied its neighbors, was engaging in repression and colonizations of lands they had seized, there'd be a lot of people of African ancestry, along with some white progressives who might be somewhat defensive about advocating boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, even where justifiable. In addition, the fact that historically boycotts of Jewish businesses were part of anti-Semitic campaigns, including in Germany immediately preceding the Holocaust, can, somewhat understandably bring up fears and suspicions among many Jews in the face of calls for boycotts related to Israel. And the answer, of course, is not to not advocate BDS, but to keep this in mind and make clear that those of us who support BDS are doing so out of concern and solidarity with the Palestinians, and we oppose anti-Semitism. We practice zero tolerance towards any and all manifestations of anti-Semitism within the ranks of the BDS movement. And this is, and I'm mentioning this now because again, while there's certainly other governments with even worse human rights records in Israel, the vast majority of these abuses take place within their internationally recognized borders, and the repression is immoral regardless of what side of an internationally recognized border it takes place. The international community does have a particular legal obligation to defend the rights of those under foreign belligerent occupation, including their right to national self-determination. And multinational corporations have certain unique moral and legal responsibility regarding investing in non-self-governing territories, including those recognized as being under foreign belligerent occupation. Today, there are only 2 countries that are engaged in what the United Nations, the World Court, and virtually the entire international community recognize as a foreign belligerent occupation of entire nations: Israel and Morocco. I mean, there are some nations such as Ukraine, Cyprus, and Azerbaijan, which are partially occupied, and other nations such as Tibet, which arguably have a moral right to independence, but are not recognized by the international community as under occupation. But Western Sahara and Palestine are currently the world's only legally recognized captive nations. And as with the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, a number of companies support Morocco's ongoing illegal occupation of Western Sahara. And as in the case of the Israeli-occupied territories, Western arms manufacturers have provided weapons to Moroccan occupation forces and engaging in gross and systematic human rights abuses. Western mining companies and other extractive industries have signed contracts to exploit natural resources of Western Sahara, thereby violating international legal prohibitions against such operations in non-self-governing territories where the indigenous population does not have a say in the process or are able to benefit from the operations. And this includes purchasing phosphates from the Moroccan government-owned mining company. This includes the very rich fishing grounds off of Morocco's coast. And what I've been arguing to my fellow Palestine solidarity activists is that the credibility of those of us concerned about the Israeli occupation would be strengthened if, instead of calling for divestment specifically from companies supporting the Israeli occupation, the call was for divestment from companies supporting all recognized foreign belligerent occupations of captive nations. And given that Morocco, and similarly, given that Moroccan universities are even more closely tied to their government than Israeli universities, advocates of academic boycotts of Israel should target Morocco as well. And as with Palestine, Western Saharan civil society strongly supports such efforts and has called for just such solidarity campaigns, just for such a BDS campaign. And since it would effectively mean just one additional country and only a small number of companies and academic institutions, it would not take that much attention away from the Israeli occupation and their corporate backers. And more importantly, though, it would help move the debate from a divisive pro-Israel versus anti-Israel dichotomy, to this idea of why are you singling out the world's only Jewish states, anti-Semitic, et cetera, to a debate where it belongs: human rights, international law, the right of self-determination. Because Morocco, of course, is a predominantly Arab Muslim country, and by including West Sahara along with Palestine, BDS advocates could then avoid the accusation that it is unfairly singling out Israel. And and of course, not only would including all occupations, that is Palestine and Western Sahara, and the divestment campaign help protect BDS advocates from spurious charges of anti-Semitism and would thereby broaden its appeal, it would help bring attention to the self-determination struggle of the Sahrawi people and the illegal and oppressive occupation of their country, which is going on almost as long as the Israeli conquest of the West Bank and other Arab territories. And it would make given the suffering of both the Palestinians and the Sahrawi peoples, and the complicity of Western governments and Western corporations, the Sahrawi people deserves attention no less than the Palestinians. And again, I'm not saying put any less attention on Palestine. I'm not saying let's not weaken the BDS call, but let's extend it. Let's make it more inclusive, because I believe it would strengthen both movements. And it's also important because, I mentioned the double standard of Arab country governments, but we're seeing it elsewhere as well, including in the United Nations, unfortunately. For a number of years, I was on the governing board of the North American Coordinating Committee of NGOs on the question of Palestine. And every year we would gather at the United Nations, and I was giving one of the plenary talks one year, and it was about the illegal Israeli annexation of Greater East Jerusalem, and talking about how U.S. policy had shifted to effectively under the Clinton administration to effectively recognize this illegal annexation. And I just had one little line in there where I had mentioned this is not unique. U.S. policy in disregarding international legal norms is not unique to the Israeli occupation. I mentioned, I did mention that we'd seen this in U.S. support for Indonesia's occupation of East Timor, which is still going on at that time, and Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara. And the woman who then headed the Secretariat office on the question of Palestine called me up and encouraged me to drop that line because Morocco was then chair of the Arab League, and they'd have their representatives at this meeting I was speaking, and they thought it would be awkward for me to bring that up. Of course, I said no, and I went ahead anyway. And similarly, you know, the UN has had United Nations has passed a whole series of resolution regarding illegal Israeli settlements, citing the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits the transfer of civilian population onto territory seized by military force. There have been no specific resolutions regarding the large-scale, colonization of the Western Sahara by Morocco, which proportionally is far greater even than what the Israelis have done. Now, though it's certainly frustrating for those of us concerned about Western Sahara that there has not been greater international activism and solidarity. Again, I don't want to imply there hasn't been. There is a small but growing movement in Europe in particular, as well as similar civil society initiatives in South Africa, other African countries, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the United States, and elsewhere. And a growing focus has been on the illegal exploitation of natural resources in Western Sahara. It's provided an important angle, again, using international law, which prohibits any government and companies from illegally taking advantage of the occupation. And we've been targeting them through campaigns advocating boycotts and divestment. At this point, unfortunately, the movements are too small to have much impact on government policies, particularly those of France and the United States, which are the two governments most responsible for the failure of the United Nations to address this conflict. But this has changed. I mean, just over a quarter, 25 years ago, there was relatively little civil society activity in developed nations regarding East Timor. But a dramatic growth in such activism in the late 1990s played an important role in making possible East Timor's eventual independence. I understand you had a lecture about that as part of this series just recently. I really think that something along the lines of East Timor could be a model. Basically, what happened was that enough civil society activism, especially in the United States, Canada, Britain, and Australia, which were the major Western backers of the Indonesian occupation, essentially embarrassed their governments to the point where it became politically difficult for them to continue supporting the occupation. And when the Indonesian economy plummeted during the big Southeast Asian economic collapse in the late 90s. These Western governments essentially said to Indonesia, "Hey, we'd like to help you out, but this East Timor thing is making politically impossible. This hanging on to this territory isn't worth it to you. Please, you need to give it up. Allow for self-determination." And a similar campaign may be the best hope for the people of Western Sahara. It's going to be harder because, frankly, Western Sahara, for political reasons, economic reasons, is more important to Morocco than East Timor was for Indonesia. But it doesn't mean it can't happen. But this is very, very important, and not just for the people of Western Sahara. It's the best hope we have to save the vitally important post-World War II legal principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Because if the international community can't fulfill its responsibilities on such a clear and moral imperative as self-determination, how can we deal with more complex issues? If the international community cannot uphold the fundamental right of self-determination of Palestinians and Sahrawis, how can it successfully defend other human rights? If the international community cannot enforce a series of UN Security Council resolutions regarding such a blatant violation of the UN Charter as a member state invading, occupying, annexing, and colonizing a neighboring country, how can it enforce other provisions of international law? And here's a point that I think is really, really important to raise. We're not talking about anything radical here. We're not talking about socialist revolution, bringing down the whole capitalist imperialist system, though personally I wouldn't object to that myself. But what we're talking about here is simply upholding mainstream liberal values, the United Nations Charter, the Fourth Geneva Conventions, the decolonization, self-determination. These are pretty basic. I mean, these are things that the international community supposedly agreed about 70 years ago. And as a result, we're not talking about simply the future of two small nations. We're not just talking about the rights of Palestinians and Sahrawis. We're talking about which principle will prevail in the 21st century, the right of self-determination or the right of conquest. The answer could determine the fate not just of Palestine and Western Sahara, but that of the entire international legal order for many decades to come.